Emma, hello. Welcome to Public Discourse.
Hi, Patrick. Thanks for having me on today.
Oh, and it's my pleasure, and it comes at a perfect time to be talking about pronatalism, pro-family policy. We're speaking just a couple, I guess, 2 weeks now after the 2024 election, and obviously that's been a hot topic of controversy over the last couple weeks and months, and I think it will continue to be part of the public discourse for the foreseeable future. And so we're incredibly grateful to you for joining us today to talk about an article you wrote for us over the summer. And I'd love for you to just give our viewers, our readers, a lengthy elevator rides pitch of what is Silicon Valley pronatalism and what do you think it gets right and wrong?
So, pronatalism has become a buzzword to say the least on the right, with major organizations from Heritage, American Compass, you all, the Ethics and Public Policy Center, Public Discourse, and others, really digging into this question of what does it mean to have more children? And this is by and large driven by the fact that our birth rates in the United States and across the world are plummeting. So, as of 2023, there were only an average of 1.62 children born per average. On average per woman, which is well below the 2.1 replacement rate. And long term, as we've already started to see, this has a major impact on a society's ability to simply reproduce itself and to continue to function. So, a lot of people from policymakers into Silicon Valley have begun asking the question of how do we increase birth rates? And so, typically, the discourse falls between like a pro family versus a pronatalist distinction. So I find myself sort of in the pro family camp that recognizes the essential role of family formation, beginning with man woman marriage, as the solution to our birth crisis. Whereas those who are perhaps more broadly in the pronatalist movement simply want to see more children born, whether or not that occurs within the natural context of the family. But one of the things that really stood out to me as I have been researching this topic is that Silicon Valley has a very particular goal when it comes to its pronatalist efforts that actually supersede both of those categories. And so, in particular, the pronatalism of Silicon Valley views technology as a solution to and a way to achieve not only more children, but a certain kind of child. And so, in many cases, the pronatalists of Silicon Valley aren't simply hoping that like more babies are born using in vitro fertilization or surrogacy or another reproductive technology, but that they're wanting to use these technologies and fine tune these technologies to really select the best kind of child that they can. Now, of course, the best kind of child is a very broad term, but typically that involves children who are healthy, so they don't have any life threatening or life inhibiting diseases or conditions. But this also includes things like the child's intellectual aptitude, even their personality, the way they interact with the world. And there seems to be this sentiment that even if the pronatalist efforts of Silicon Valley are not widely applicable because they tend to be incredibly expensive and limited to sort of a niche audience, that at least they and their children will sort of be able to survive this potential demographic decline, that they'll be the best kind of children that they can be, avoiding a lot of the potential health or mental factors that naturally plague childbearing.
Yeah, so you're right, I think, to point out the kind of weirdness, to use a popular phrase from this campaign cycle, of some of these conversations. You look at some of the reporting around perhaps the world's, certainly the world's richest and maybe a highest profile proponent of pronatalism, Elon Musk, who is some eccentric behavior, and maybe you can talk about that, about what he's done in his own personal life. We saw that the Telegram founder Pavel Durov, who's facing legal trouble of his own, but recently made an offer to Russian women who want to get pregnant. He said, "I'll cover your IVF expenses so long as you use my genetic material." And so before you even get to, and I do want to get to some of the technologies and developments on that front. What is it about the culture or these individuals or their sort of attitude towards what it means to be human, maybe, that leaves them in these sort of uh, almost pre-medieval ideas of having a lineage and having being fathering this many children without actually playing a role of involved father necessarily.
Yeah, no, this is a really good question. I think Mary Harrington's cyborg meat bags or meat bodies term really sums this up well, where there seems to be a mix of certainly a techno optimism, a delight in their own abilities, right? Like, I think in some ways, those in the Silicon Valley world are incredibly brilliant, incredibly smart, incredibly innovative people who are responsible for some of the best technological developments of our generation, and hopefully ones that will only get better. Like, that's an incredible contribution to the human race, to what it means to be human, to really pursue excellence in our fullest potential. It seems to then bleed into like to really weird areas, as you said, when that becomes not only do we delight in the expanse of what it means to be human, but we want to move beyond what it means to be human, sort of along this transhumanist route, in order to not only be excellent as humans, but perhaps be some sort of post human being, right? That's able to do more than the natural person. And that certainly falls within the realm of fertility. So, not only be more than one would naturally be if you were just created within marriage, right, and born, selecting or even like altering DNA to have like sort of the most creative, the most intelligent, the most innovative children born. And then maybe just a bit of hubris and pride, right? A belief that like they maybe perhaps are like one of the best things to happen to Earth. So why wouldn't lots of women want to have their children? Why wouldn't they want to sort of spread their seed wide and far? It has unfortunate overlaps with Andrew Tate and I think others sort of in like the red pill online men's movement too, right? Of like wanting to conquer the world through children, but any children by any means, not necessarily a strong family or dynasty in that sense. So yeah, it's like a weird, like you said, reversion back to the Middle Ages with I think a lot of different themes that are playing out there. And then with Elon Musk in particular, his story is one that I think is far more humane and is probably one of the most relatable, though misguided, accounts that I have ever read. So he has now 12 children, or he has a total of 12 children. One died as an infant with three different women. He was romantically involved with two of these women. The third woman was just a surrogate, an egg donor, effectively. He liked her genes, she liked his. They decided to create some super babies. Now he's, as a side note, building this, like, hoping to purchase this, like, multi property mansion so that all of his children and their mothers can, like, live on the same property with him. A way of trying to solve the fact that when you have a ton of kids by different women, you just don't see them very often. But that's an aside. But the thing with Elon Musk's story that I think stands out to me the most is that his first child was conceived and born naturally, without the use of IVF or any of these technologies. And a few months into the child's life, he or she unfortunately suffered from SIDS, or sudden infant death syndrome. And by the time Elon Musk and his then wife found the baby, it was too late. And so they had the baby on life support for a couple of days. And both have really harrowing accounts of just sitting in the hospital holding the child, like unable to let go. And as a parent myself, someone who's expecting her second child soon, I cannot imagine like a more horrifying yeah, I just can't imagine a more horrifying situation. And I think that's probably like one of like the biggest fears that anyone has, right? Is that the child that you love, that you've invested quite literally your entire self into, could somehow just be taken away from you like that, outside of your control, outside of your ability to protect them. And I think that experience had a massive impact on Elon Musk, on the way he thought about childbearing, the vulnerability, the fear, the lack of control that you have. Because notably, since then, all of his children have been conceived using a form of in vitro fertilization, pre-implantation genetic testing, even surrogacy. And those technologies, I think at a fundamental level, represent humanity's attempt to control every aspect of fertility, to sort of take away the vulnerability, take away the potential yeah, acts of nature that are just truly horrific, and do the best that you possibly can to protect yourself and to protect your children from any sort of loss. So in many ways, like that seems to be the driving force behind these technologies, especially in instances like Elon Musk, where even if the technologies are incredibly weird and I think dehumanizing on a lot of levels, the drive for them is probably one of the most relatable in the human experience. And I think that that's a temptation that many, if not all, parents experience. The difference being that Elon Musk and others in Silicon Valley just have the means to actually act on it, whereas most people simply don't have the funds or technology available to really try to mitigate those natural fears.
No, that's a very important point to bring up, that the desire to have kids, even in these sort of attenuated, highly technological, morally dubious technologies that you're talking about, it is grounded to something, meaningful and real and human. And so that's to be celebrated in the same way that, obviously he's an extreme example, but a lot of couples, a lot of women who pursue some of these technologies aren't doing it for strictly eugenic reasons, and we can talk about that strain of pronatalism if we want to. But the vast majority of these are happening because it was difficult to find a husband until it's too late to biologically conceive. Maybe you had some health issues that prevented you from being able to do this. So by the time you froze your eggs because you were concerned about the likelihood of finding Mr. Right and that sort of thing. And so sometimes by the time you wait until you're in your mid 30s, you were told that this was an option, right? That you could pursue career and family and not have to make that trade off. And unfortunately, a lot of women, because they're the tend to be the ones who are most impacted by this, face that challenge of, well, where else can I go if this is not working? Naturally, what medical interventions can we pursue? And it often looks like something like IVF. And I think, again, that's a very human instinct. But I would be curious to hear your thoughts on the ability to intervene upstream, and how the focus on infertility as a problem to be solved via these different medical devices is actually maybe ignoring some of these bigger cultural changes that would make it maybe easier for women and men to have kids earlier in life.
Yeah, this is a great question. And this is the part of the Silicon Valley fertility space that I'm actually incredibly excited by. Nicole Shanahan, who was RFK Jr.'s former running mate in particular, is one of the leaders in Silicon Valley in this realm of like upstream solutions to fertility. So she has invested hundreds of millions of her own funds into different efforts to understand the natural life cycle of female fertility, find ways to naturally extend a woman's ability to conceive and bear children. There are pros and cons to that. I don't think that's like just a net positive per se, especially as our like lifespan still remains relatively the same. But she's really wrestling with that question of how can we actually address the underlying causes of infertility rather than seeking to circumvent the problem with in vitro fertilization or other technologies. So in the United States, reproductive health conditions are the leading cause of infertility or a difficulty in getting pregnant. So reproductive health conditions for women include issues like endometriosis, polycystic ovary syndrome or ovarian syndrome, blocked fallopian tubes, hormonal imbalances, really a host of different reproductive factors that correspond with a lot of conditions such as diabetes, cancer, even heart failure in women, but can just affect their overall well-being. For men, reproductive health conditions look like things like low sperm count, low sperm motility, erectile dysfunction, and just like general lack of health due to their nutrition, due to their lifestyle. Substance abuse actually has a pretty big impact on a man's ability to conceive or conceive healthy children. And so these conditions, by and large, have been overlooked when it comes to our discourse on fertility until the last few years. So it's estimated, just to give you like ideas, right, that like there's about I think like close to 20% of the population has a form of reproductive health condition. So polycystic ovary syndrome or PCOS is incredibly popular. About 10% of the female population has endometriosis, which if it progresses to a later stage can be incredibly difficult to treat, incredibly difficult to have children naturally. And in many of these cases, it takes women anywhere from 6 to 12 years before they receive a diagnosis, before they can even begin treating these conditions. And when you talk about the woman's fertility window, right, being from sometime in her 20s to maybe 40s or early 40s at the absolute latest, that's a massive chunk of time that we're talking about, a massive chunk of lost time where women aren't able to actually, potentially not even able to have children, even if they found a partner. So so that's an area that I've really been focusing on is how can we actually start targeting overall reproductive health before we find ourselves in these situations of infertility. So one of the most, I think, like classic examples is you have a young woman, she's a teenager, she's suffering from really painful cycles every month. She goes to the doctor to try to get help. And by and large, if you're going to a standard medical practice, the solution is just going to be either take Advil once a month, suffer through it, you've got this, it's part of being a woman, or here's a prescription for birth control. Maybe they'll do some testing to find which birth control works best with your body, maybe not. And this should help with the symptoms. And certainly in many cases, it will suppress the symptoms. But the problem is that with suppressing the symptoms, you're also you're not actually addressing the underlying condition, the problem at play, right? And so in many cases, if you do have something like endometriosis or PCOS, those conditions are only continuing to get worse. You just don't realize it because the symptoms have been masked. And so then if you go on birth control to help mitigate these symptoms for 5, maybe 10 years, you come off birth control once you're ready to start having children. And then all of a sudden, not only are you experiencing insanely painful cycles each month, but then you realize that you're not able to conceive like you thought you would be able to, and that the condition is a lot worse. And that's just like an incredibly heartbreaking situation. I think it's just a prime example of the way that our one size fits all approach to medical care has really failed women and failed men too, right? I don't know of many, if any, men who are actually being trained to think about their own fertility. What are markers of healthy fertility? What are markers of unhealthy fertility to really be proactive in that? Um, and so, yeah, so the more that we can actually like proactively assess overall reproductive health, totally distinct from fertility, we actually set ourselves up for fertility success when the time comes. Yeah, so I think that's probably one of the most important approaches, because what we found too is that even though there's no guarantee that you can solve your infertility, that you can heal the underlying causes and naturally conceive children, that your chances by addressing these underlying causes of infertility are much, much higher. So overall, freezing your eggs, which is an incredibly fraught process. I think on average, like if you want, like study, like CDC data shows, like if you want to successfully conceive a child from frozen eggs, you have to freeze at least 20, which usually requires at least 2 rounds of egg freezing, which can be incredibly expensive. And even then, you're not guaranteed that the eggs will work. Then you use IVF, which overall has about a 23% success rate. It drops as women get older significantly. And instead of putting women and couples in this position where they're then left potentially, yeah, without the ability to naturally have children or having to jump through significant hoops to get there, focusing on these proactive preventative measures is actually, I think, one of the most like pronatalist, pro-fertility, pro-family measures that we can pursue today, because it teaches people to understand, to love, to know their body in a way that I think we're just not currently achieving with a lot of our discourse on reproductive technology.
That's really informative, and I think important to think about the fact that infertility almost always is a disease, or a condition that's experienced socially, right? It's not the same as just having a skin disorder, or whatever it is. Like, this is something that often happens in the context of it takes two to tango, right? And so
Yeah.
helping both sides of the equation think about that is going to be incredibly important going forward. I also want to spend a little bit of time talking about the other side of the equation as well, because I think, as the pro-life community, we can all get on board with ideas of helping better understand the reproductive cycle and all these sort of things that can help lead to healthy babies. On the other hand, there are obviously, ethical concerns with things that the Silicon Valley pronatalist approach would want to push, right? And I think starting with eugenics and sex selection and different things like that, the U.S., as I understand it, is fairly much a wild west when it comes to some of these regulations around what technology you can use and how you can use them. Do you sense that there's any low hanging fruit? I mean, again, obviously, I don't think we're here to try to think, massive big picture thinking about what our ideal regime would look like, but just in terms of practical steps that an administration that wants to protect life and ensure, the strong families and all those sort of things. What are some of the areas that you think politicians should be looking at in terms of what makes the U.S. such an outlier in some of these things?
Yes, this is a really good question. And the United States really is an outlier of other developed countries that have the ability to access these technologies. One of the things that stands out is that the United States has very few regulations, period, on the federal or state level with how in vitro fertilization or any reproductive technologies are practiced, whereas the United Kingdom, Canada, other countries have very specific steps and limits as to how you can engage with it. So in the United States, I think some of the low hanging fruit, and frankly, like anything is like there's so little on the books that almost anything would like take us a step further. So like when it comes to low hanging fruit, one of the areas that I have been working a lot on is simply requiring good reporting mechanisms for assisted reproductive technology. So the CDC tracks very basic outcomes, but there are a lot of unanswered questions. So things like how many embryos are created annually each year in the US. We know how many cycles are performed, and that's over I think like 413 cycles annually on average, but we have no idea how many embryos are actually being created per cycle. So if it was 10 embryos per cycle, right, you're looking at around 4 million embryos, but oftentimes the number is a bit lower. But still, you're looking potentially anywhere from 1 million to 4 million embryos every year. If you believe that life begins at conception, not merely when the child is born, right, then that actually matters a lot for how we're thinking about this issue, right? Because this isn't simply like a medical treatment. This is the creation of human life. And how we apply technology, how we regulate that through law matters a lot for how I think we think about what it means to be human and be just in our interactions towards one another. So that's one approach, is looking at just basics of how many embryos are created, what's happening to the embryos once they're created, how many are being tested, how many are destroyed, how many are implanted or frozen, how many frozen embryos do we have in the US? That's one route that you can go. Another would just be looking at serious informed consent laws with parents, with egg donors and sperm donors. So in many cases, I think that parents and egg donors find themselves in a situation where they're not fully aware of the physical or mental side effects of using these technologies. So across the board, we found that children conceived through in vitro fertilization have worse health outcomes. Mothers who undergo in vitro fertilization have worse health outcomes in pregnancy and beyond. Surrogate mothers have like the worst outcomes across the board. And just this past week, there was another story of a San Diego mother, surrogate mother, who died due to pregnancy complications while she was carrying a child for another family, leaving behind two small children, right? And in many cases, we're not adequately sitting down to discuss very practically what these risks are that we're engaging in and how to maybe best mitigate those with better drugs that are used, fewer drugs, situations like that. And then, of course, an area that I would love to see more action on would be the use of pre-implantation genetic testing. And so pre-implantation genetic testing, which is pretty synonymous with Silicon Valley pronatalism in many cases, focuses on assessing the quality of the embryo. And so you can find out at the most basic level, like what the sex of the embryo is, what are any monogenetic conditions that the embryo could have, things like Down syndrome, right, that we currently have like pregnancy tests for as well. But the way that certain technologies or certain like aspects of pre-implantation genetic testing are being developed are allowing us to move beyond the realm of monogenetic diseases to polygenetic diseases. So does this child have a disposition toward hearing loss? Does this child have a disposition toward obesity or insulin resistance, right? But in some of the more dystopian parts, you're also seeing this technology applied to personality or intellectual aptitude. So, are these clusters of genetic factors more likely to dispose your child to creativity? Or to compassion or kindness. And so you see certain parents really playing, uh, I think, too heavy handed of a role in the development of their child, not simply nurturing these virtues in the child once they're born, but trying to select children with that. And of course, anytime you talk about selecting children, you're also talking about destroying the unwanted children. And I think that's the part of the conversation that, for obvious reason, is really brushed over in many of these cases. Because many times parents really do view these embryos as their children. Personhood laws are not aside, right? Like that has very little to do with it. There's an understanding that you've created these embryos for the purpose of creating a child, and the more you humanize that it's not only selecting the healthy ones, but it also means destroying the unhealthy ones. I think that adds just a new layer to the discussion. So thinking about ways that we could regulate, that we could limit that use of technology so that we're not just creating children for the wanton purpose of arbitrarily selecting some, destroying others because of concerns that may or may not even affect their overall well-being in life.
Well, a good dose of optimism is a great place to leave this conversation. I mean, you are one of the people who are following this issue more closely than any, most anybody I know. If other people want to follow what you're keeping eyes on, where can they keep track of your work?
So you can find me on X at EML Waters or through the Heritage Foundation. Most of my articles are republished on that page, and you're certainly always welcome to reach out for further conversations.
Wonderful. Emma, thank you so much for taking the time today, and we'll look forward to the future deep dive from PD coming up soon. Thanks.